Good morning, children. Welcome to the English session. We will be discussing the first chapter from the Flamingo textbook, The Last Lesson by Alphonse Daudet, who was a French novelist and a short story writer. In this session, I will talk about the background of the story, explanation, and the summary of the story. Background of the story. During the Franco-Prussian War, which took place in 1870-71, France was defeated by Prussia, led by Otto von Bismarck, who was a German statesman. The French districts of Alsace and Lorraine were occupied by Germany. A young boy named Franz is the narrator of the lesson. He talks about his last lesson of French language at school. German forces had instructed that German language will be taught instead of French in the districts of Alsace and Lorraine. Explanation. A young boy, Franz, was late for school. He was afraid that he would get a scolding from his teacher, Mr. Hamel. He was also afraid because his teacher was supposed to question them on participles. He did not know the participles at all. He was wondering if he would go late, and as he did not know the participles, he would surely get a scolding from his teacher. So instead of going to school, he thought of spending out as it was warm, bright, and sunny. He was always interested in going out, playing, and watching the birds chirping on the trees and the Prussian soldiers drilling out. He felt all this was more tempting than studying in the class. Resisted this thought and hurried off to school. On his way, when he passed the town hall, there was a crowd in front of the bulletin board. The bulletin board is a board where all the news is put up. As the war was going on, all the news that is being conveyed to the people was through the bulletin board at the town hall. So when the bulletin board was crowded, it meant some new news had been put up there. Franz was wondering what the news could be when the blacksmith called out, "Don't go so fast, bub. You will get to your school in plenty of time." But the only thought in the mind of Franz was to reach the school as fast as possible. So he ignores the comment and goes on his way to the school. The scene at the school is unusual. Usually there is a lot of hassle during the school hours caused by the opening and closing of desks, repetition of lessons, the teacher's ruler banging on the table, and more. But that day, everything was as quiet as a Sunday morning. He was more confused as what could be the matter. He peeped through the window and found it quite strange to see the class seated, and Mr. Hamel moving around with his ruler under his arm. Franz enters the class, and Mr. Hamel is very calm. He calmly says, "Go to your place." After some time, when he recovers, he sees that his teacher was dressed in his best attire. He was wearing a beautiful green coat, his frilled shirt, his little black silk cap, all embroidered. This dress is usually worn by his teacher only on special occasions. But Franz was wondering what was special today, that his teacher was dressed in his special attire. After some time, Franz notices all the village men seated on the last bench in the classroom, which were usually found empty. He was wondering why the village men were occupied in the classroom. While all this was going on in Franz's mind, the teacher, Mr. Hamel, sits in his chair and calmly addresses them, and he says, "My children, this is the last lesson I shall give you. The order has come from Berlin to teach only German in the schools of Alsace and Lorraine. The new master comes tomorrow. This is your last French lesson. I want you to be very attentive." So now everything made sense to him. He realized why his teacher was wearing his formal clothes, why the village men had gathered at the back of the classroom, and why there was a crowd in front of the bulletin board. So the news was, the order has come from Berlin to teach only German in the schools of Alsace and Lorraine. That unusual day would be the last lesson of French that would be taught in the schools. Franz was shocked to know that it was his last lesson in his French language, as he didn't know how to read and write French. Further, the idea that his teacher, Mr. Hamel, is going away, he will never get to see him again, made him forget the ruler and how cranky he was. This is actually a contrast. Earlier, Franz was afraid of Mr. Hamel as he was a strict teacher, but now he is shocked at the fact that his teacher is going. He feels sad that he will not get to see his teacher anymore. The villageman's presence was a tribute to the master for his selfless and faithful service for 40 years. They also felt sorry for themselves that they had not gone to school for longer. All this thought was going on in his mind when his teacher called him as it was Franz's turn to recite the participles. He gets very nervous. He fumbles after speaking a few words as he doesn't know the participles. But from within, he is really desperate that he would have known the lesson and he could have recited all of it once without any mistakes if he had attended the classes properly. But as he doesn't know the participles, he is not able to recite and fumbles after speaking a few words. The teacher says, "I won't scold you, little Franz. You must feel bad enough as you are not able to recite the participles." So the teacher wants Franz to introspect himself, the importance of education. Mr. Hamel says, "All of Alsace has the habit of postponing their learning till tomorrow. They think that they have plenty of time, and so they do not do anything and put it off to the next day." And now he says that it is their last lesson and the day has finally arrived. The time is over for them to study French and they do not know anything. Then he says sarcastically that the Germans would laugh at them as they do not know their own language. To that, Mr. Hamel praises French for being the most beautiful language in the world. He says that it is the most logical and all the French people should guard their language and never forget it. He feels that as long as one holds on to their language, they will never be enslaved as it is the key to their prison. After that, he reads out a grammar lesson to the class, and Franz hears very attentively, and now it seemed that he understands it very well. The fact that he was never going to learn French again made him listen to Mr. Hamel very attentively. The grammar lesson was followed by a lesson in writing. That day, Mr. Hamel gave them new copies on which was beautifully written, "Franz Alsace, Franz Alsace." This showed a sense of patriotism in the class. All the students had an unusual feeling. Earlier, they were interested in bunking the class, going out to play, and watching birds. But now they realized the importance of education, the importance of their mother tongue as it was the last lesson. So they were having a feeling of bonding with their country. The only sound that could be heard in the class was the scratching of pens as everyone was writing very seriously. Franz suddenly heard a pigeon cooing and found himself wondering if they would be made to sing in German as well or not. Language is so not natural to a person. The Germans are in fact taking away their mother tongue from them and are imposing them to learn German. This brings forward the critical question of linguistic chauvinism and denial of the freedom of one's own language. As Franz looked up from the desk, he saw Mr. Hamel sitting idle. He fixed his gaze at everything in the room from time to time. It seemed like he wanted to capture everything about the schoolroom in his mind. He can hear his sister packing the bags on the first floor of the classroom as they had been living there for the past 40 years and now he was made to leave the country. The villageman, Mr. Hauser, was reading his primer, which he has got. Primer is a basic book of language. He was reading it and was trembling with emotions. Church clock struck 12, and finally it was time for the class to get over. At the same time, the Prussian soldiers returning from the drill were heard. Mr. Hamel turned to the blackboard and wrote "Vive la France," which means "Long live France," with a hope that the French language will be appreciated for what it is. After that, Mr. Hamel tries to speak something, but is unable to, so he gestures to the class that the school is dismissed and they may leave. The summary of the story. The story is of a French boy, Franz. He is lazy but sensitive and likes to play. He dreads studying French and hates his teacher After overpowering their districts of Alsace and Lorraine, Berlin has ordered that German be taught in schools there. The last day of their teacher, Mr. Hamel, who has been there for 40 years, he is full of grief, nostalgic, and patriotic. As a mark of respect to his hard work, the village men are there to attend the last lesson. Franz is shocked that it is his last lesson, but he does not know French. Now he gets interested in learning and understands everything taught on that day. He develops an instant liking for the teacher and respects him for his sincerity and hard work. He feels sad at the thought of departing from him and feels ashamed for not being able to recite the lessons. Hamel tells them that they all are at fault for not being eager enough to learn, putting it off for the next day. He told them to guard it as being close to one's language is the key to escape from the prison of slavery. Lies the importance of learning their language and that they have been defeated because of their illiteracy. Franz feels that it is not possible to take away one's language from him, as it is natural for each being, may it be the coo to the pigeons or French to them. So that's the end of the session. Thank you and have a nice day.